The entire auditorium heard Eleanor's father say that the man standing beside her did not belong on that stage, did not belong in that family, and had no place in a room built for accomplished people. Parents turned. Teachers froze. Children looked up from their paper medals and bright cardboard certificates. Eleanor said nothing. The staff said nothing. And Julian, the quiet husband everyone had learned to overlook, only looked toward his son, adjusted the small blue ribbon on the boy's jacket, and stood there with the still face of a man who had already lived through the part meant to break him. 3 weeks earlier, they buried his mother on a Thursday morning, under a sky that could not decide whether it meant to rain or simply threaten it. The cemetery sat at the edge of the older part of the city, where the roads narrowed, the trees leaned low over the sidewalks, and the houses still carried porches wide enough for grief. There were not many people there. A few neighbors who had known her for decades. The pastor from the church she had attended, even when her knees had gone bad and the winter cold had become personal. A woman from the pharmacy who brought soup twice during the final month and pretended it was nothing. And Julian, standing near the casket in a dark coat that fit him the way many things in his life now fit him, adequately, without comfort. He was 39 years old. He looked older, in the way some men do when they have spent too many seasons absorbing what should have been shared. Not ruined, not collapsed, just worn into silence. There is a kind of exhaustion that does not announce itself. It does not shake. It does not cry out. It simply settles into a man's shoulders and teaches him how to speak less. The narrator wants you to understand something about Julian before anything else. He was not the sort of man people describe as brilliant within 5 minutes of meeting him. He did not dominate rooms. He did not turn heads in restaurants. He was not built for performance. He was built for reliability, which is a quality the world praises in public and undervalues in practice. He arrived when he said he would. He noticed what other people forgot. He remembered dates nobody reminded him of. He listened fully when others only paused long enough to talk next. He had the particular steadiness of a man who thinks promises are not decoration. His mother, Margaret, had seen that in him when he was still young enough to believe gentleness might be enough to protect a person from being used. She had told him often that the world mistakes quiet men for empty men because noise has become the language of false importance. She had raised him carefully, not with fantasy, but with patience. She taught him that dignity is not passivity, and restraint is not weakness, and that some truths do not arrive quickly because they are not for people who need to be impressed. Now she was gone. Julian stood by the grave until the last handful of earth had landed, and the voices had thinned, and the cars had pulled away. He remained there a little longer, just him and the new headstone and the wet scent of cut grass and turned soil. He did not cry there. He had done that alone in a hospital parking lot 2 nights before she died, when the doctor stopped saying treatment options and began speaking in the clean, irreversible language that doctors use when hope has moved out of the room. By the time the funeral came, grief in him had changed shape. It had become less sharp, more deliberate. The pain was not smaller, it was simply no longer surprised by itself. Eleanor had not come. She called that morning from the school auditorium where their son Nathan's honors ceremony rehearsal was taking longer than expected. She said she could not leave because her father was helping sponsor the event and everything was already in motion, and there were too many moving parts, and she hoped Julian understood. Julian listened. He said he understood. He always said that when there was no practical benefit in saying anything else. Their marriage had not failed in one loud moment. It had eroded in the ordinary places. That is how many marriages end long before they formally end. Not in betrayal first, not in violence, not even in cruelty, but in 100 small diminishments that gather quietly until one day the distance has furniture. They lived in a tasteful home in a wealthy suburb where the trees were trimmed before they had the chance to look wild, and the houses were built with enough space between them to imply privacy and enough similarity to imply competition. Julian drove a 7-year-old sedan that ran beautifully because he maintained it. Eleanor drove a new imported SUV because her father said appearances save time. Julian wore suits that were well cleaned, carefully pressed, and 3 seasons older than the ones worn by the men Eleanor's father respected. To the outside world, Julian appeared to work in administrative operations for a mid-sized medical logistics firm. The job title was ordinary by design. The salary that entered the visible accounts was modest by arrangement. His life, to anyone watching casually, looked stable but unimpressive. Eleanor was not a cruel woman. The narrator is careful here. Cruelty requires active intent. Eleanor had drifted into something else, something more polished and in many ways more damaging. She had become dismissive. She spoke about Julian the way efficient people speak about a household system that functions but inspires nothing. She did not insult him directly. She simply stopped treating his interior life as real. She had become adept at making room for him without making space for him. She was good at her own work. She ran charitable event campaigns for foundations, private schools, and medical boards. She knew how to move through polished rooms with effortless conversation and the right smile at the right angle and a memory for names that made donors feel seen. Her father admired this in her because it resembled him. Victor Hale had built a healthcare investment empire over 25 years and wore his success not like an accomplishment, but like a theology. He believed a man's worth should be visible at a glance. In the watch, in the car, in the square footage, in the title written beneath his name on event programs. He had never hidden his opinion of Julian. 7 years earlier, at their engagement dinner, Victor had asked Julian whether he considered himself ambitious. And when Julian answered that he considered himself responsible, Victor had smiled the narrow smile of a man who already knew he would be disappointed. He had remained disappointed ever since. Nathan was 8. He had Julian's eyes, the kind that seemed older than the face carrying them, and Margaret's smile, immediate and unguarded and still untouched by strategy. He was the clearest part of Julian's life. Children sometimes become that for men living inside emotional fog. The one relationship where tenderness does not need translation. Nathan did not care how much money Julian appeared to make. He cared that Julian knew how to fix the loose wheel on his science model, that he never forgot library day, that he answered serious questions as if children deserved serious answers. 2 weeks before Margaret died, she asked Julian to close the hospital room door. Evening had already settled. The monitors cast their soft, indifferent light. The city beyond the window glowed with the distance of other people's uninterrupted lives. She was weaker than he had ever seen her, but her mind remained exact. She asked him if he still believed that being underestimated had cost him anything that could not be returned. Julian sat beside the bed and told her that some things are not returned in the form they were lost. She smiled faintly at that, because she heard in it the man he had become. Then she told him there was a reason she had protected certain truths from him while he was younger. Not because she doubted his intelligence, because she wanted to know whether power would arrive in the hands of a man or a boy. She said his grandfather had built something too large to be inherited by appetite and too vulnerable to survive vanity. She said she had spent decades as its guardian, not its owner. And when her time came, it would pass to him, but only if he had become the kind of man who did not need to announce himself in order to know who he was. Julian did not interrupt. He had learned from her that some statements should not be dragged into premature clarity. She placed her hand over his and said that when the truth came, he must not rush to use it simply because others had been quick to dismiss him. She said timing is not delay when it protects meaning. 3 days after the funeral, a sealed package arrived by courier from a law office in Chicago. Julian nearly left it on the foyer table. The house had become a place of unfinished small tasks: sympathy cards, prescription receipts, school notices, groceries half put away. But the envelope was thick, old-fashioned, and marked for personal delivery only. He opened it that evening in the kitchen while Nathan worked on a solar system project at the dining table, and Eleanor took a call upstairs. Inside were 4 things: a handwritten letter in Margaret's unmistakable script, a packet of legal documents bound in navy tabs, a private access card made of dark metal with no logo on it, and a small brass key worn smooth at the edges by age or reverence. He read the letter first. Margaret wrote plainly. She told him that his grandfather, Amos Reed, had founded Halcyon Medical Holdings with 2 clinics, borrowed equipment, and a specific belief that healthcare should not belong entirely to men who treated suffering as market geography. Over 40 years, through acquisitions, regional expansions, private restructuring, and silent trust formations, that small beginning had become a vast private healthcare network. Hospitals, surgical centers, specialist institutes, research interests, emergency facilities, and controlling positions in multiple medical supply and care management entities. The total enterprise, when last valued, stood just above $38 billion. Julian read that line twice, not because he doubted the words, but because numbers at that scale have a way of arriving as abstraction first and reality second. The letter continued. His grandfather had structured ownership through layered family trusts, governance shields, and succession controls that removed public linkage. Margaret had served as trustee and protective signatory. Now, upon her death, those controls passed to Julian as sole beneficial owner and active controlling authority, provided he completed formal assumption procedures within 90 days. The narrator does not dramatize Julian's reaction because the absence of reaction is the reaction. He did not stand up suddenly. He did not call out for Eleanor. He did not pace. He simply sat very still at the kitchen table while his son cut rings around a cardboard Saturn and asked whether planets make sound in space. Julian answered that they move through silence. Then he opened the documents. The paperwork was precise, mercilessly organized, and far too comprehensive to belong to fantasy. Halcyon Medical Holdings controlled 8 major hospitals, 13 specialty centers, a high-end cancer institute, a pediatric network, equity and logistics corridors, technology licensing positions, emergency care fleets, and strategic board influence across multiple private care systems. The existing executive board had been operating under a sealed continuity agreement for 18 months, pending his formal appearance and signature. No divestment, transfer, restructuring, or public succession announcement could proceed without his authorization and physical credential access through the brass key and black metal card. The key, as the documents later explained, opened a private archive vault in the original Philadelphia hospital building, where founding charters, trust instruments, and manual override authorizations were held. It was less symbolic than it looked. It was worse. It was real. Julian set the papers down and listened to the sound of his son asking whether Jupiter was heavier than all the other planets put together. Upstairs, Eleanor laughed at something said on the phone. Outside, a landscaping crew moved through the neighbor's front yard with leaf blowers and deliberate noise. The world remained offensively ordinary. He made a decision that night, and, in many ways, the rest of the story grows from that decision. He would not speak yet. Not because he was afraid, not because he did not understand the implications, but because too much of his life had been shaped by other people's assumptions, and before power entered the visible room, he wanted to know precisely who those people were when they believed he had none. He called the attorney listed in the documents the next morning from his car in a pharmacy parking lot. The attorney's name was Stephen Whitmore. He sounded like a man whose profession had trained any excess emotion out of his vowels. He confirmed everything. He arranged a private meeting in Philadelphia. He walked Julian through the current valuation bands, governance structure, liability walls, executive continuity terms, inheritance protections, and formal succession procedure. He did not once ask Julian how he felt. Men like Whitmore are often more useful than kind. When Julian told him he needed time before formal assumption, Whitmore said that was well within his rights. When Julian asked how much time remained before outside pressure would begin to build, Whitmore said the board could hold for another 60 days without operational instability. Julian said he would use those 60 days. He began to watch. Not with paranoia, not with theatrical suspicion, just with a level gaze sharpened by the removal of self-deception. He noticed how Eleanor's tone changed when she spoke of the future. She no longer used "we" unless discussing school schedules, house repairs, or calendar obligations. The future she described was always subtly singular, even when phrased politely. He noticed how often Victor called her in the evenings, and how those calls ended with her standing straighter, colder, more certain. He noticed how frequently a family friend named Grant Mercer appeared around the edges of their life. Grant had been close to Victor for years and had, through that closeness, become close to Eleanor as well. He was the sort of man people call polished when they mean dangerous in socially acceptable ways. He laughed easily. He remembered preferences. He understood exactly how long a hand should remain on someone's shoulder to imply warmth without drawing attention. He had taken increasing interest in Nathan's schooling, Victor's foundation events, and Eleanor's scheduling problems. Julian had once been grateful for that. Gratitude, he would later think, often survives longer than evidence deserves. At a dinner 6 nights after the documents arrived, Victor asked Julian in front of 8 guests whether he had ever considered that his lack of visible ambition might eventually embarrass his wife. The table gave the question the small silence that such questions always receive. The silence of people who know a boundary has been crossed, but have no intention of paying the social price of saying so. Julian looked at Victor and answered mildly that embarrassment usually reveals more about the observer than the observed. 3 guests looked down at their plates. One woman smiled into her wineglass. Eleanor said Julian was being sensitive. Victor laughed and announced that sensitivity was the first refuge of men who had not built enough to withstand scrutiny. Grant changed the subject with professional smoothness. Julian let it go, because at that point, letting it go was not surrender. It was collection. The narrator wants you to understand the difference. There is a kind of quiet that comes from powerlessness, and another kind that comes from a man making room for truth to fully identify itself. They do not look different from across the room. That is why arrogant people misread them. The school ceremony was scheduled for mid-May in the auditorium of St. Gabriel's Academy, a private school Victor helped fund and often used as a stage for philanthropic visibility. Nathan had won a district science award for a solar-powered water purification model built mostly at the kitchen table, with Julian's patient help and Nathan's untidy enthusiasm. The school called it an innovation recognition event. Victor called it an opportunity to reinforce standards. The day began brightly enough. Nathan wore a navy blazer slightly too large in the shoulders, polished shoes, and the careful seriousness children wear when they know adults consider the day important. Julian tied the boy's tie twice because the first knot sat wrong, and Nathan said if he was going on stage, he wanted to look like he knew something about himself. Eleanor was already at the venue with Victor. She had texted that there were donors present, and she needed to be there early. Julian drove Nathan to the school in the same sedan Victor had once referred to as a rolling apology. Nathan talked the entire way about whether robots would someday become kinder than people if people kept teaching them by example. Julian asked what Nathan thought. Nathan said maybe robots would only become what the loudest people told them to be. Julian smiled at the road. The ceremony was held in a polished auditorium with vaulted ceilings, flower arrangements at the corners of the stage, and rows of parents arranged by donation tier more effectively than by any official seating policy. Teachers moved along the aisles with clipboards. Children sat in clusters with straight backs and swinging feet. Victor stood near the front in conversation with the headmaster and two board members, immaculate as always, carrying authority the way some men carry fragrance in a radius. Julian entered quietly with Nathan, adjusted the boy's blazer, and took the seat at the aisle as instructed by a volunteer. Victor noticed him at once. The narrator notes this because men like Victor always notice the people they believe lower the value of a room. Nathan's category was near the middle of the ceremony. A short speech was given. 3 names were called, then Nathan's. He walked onto the stage, holding himself with brave concentration, accepted the medal, and looked for his parents in the crowd. Julian clapped first. That matters. The father's applause reached the boy before the father's power ever did. Nathan saw him and smiled, full and immediate, the smile of a child whose confidence still travels in direct lines. Then the headmaster invited Victor Hale, lead donor and patron sponsor, to say a few words about excellence, family standards, and the importance of proper guidance. Victor liked microphones. He stood at the podium and began well. He praised the school. He praised discipline. He praised the children. He praised Nathan by name and spoke warmly about family legacy. The audience relaxed into the shape of expected flattery. Then, without altering his tone, he shifted. He said that children thrive when they are raised around meaningful examples of accomplishment. He said talent in a child must not be left in the care of men who mistake presence for contribution. He said some men stand near success long enough to confuse association with worth. He said, and here the room felt the turn before it fully understood it, that he had spent years watching his daughter carry far more than she should because she had tied herself to a man content to live beneath her. He looked directly at Julian. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Public cruelty rarely improves with volume. It sharpens with control. He said, a father is meant to elevate a household, not hide inside it. The auditorium changed temperature. A teacher near the aisle froze with a program in her hand. One of the board members glanced toward Eleanor. Eleanor stared straight ahead with the rigid face of a person whose pride is fighting panic and losing in private. Nathan remained on stage beside the science display table, medal still around his neck, not yet understanding the words, but feeling the fracture. Julian stood. He did not argue. He did not rush the stage. He did not produce a speech that would later sound triumphant in retelling. He simply walked down the aisle, stepped to the side stairs, joined Nathan near the edge of the stage, straightened the ribbon on the boy's blazer where it had twisted, and said softly enough that only Nathan heard, "You did beautifully." Then he looked up at Victor, not with heat, not with pleading, not with the face of a man humiliated in public, with the expression of someone observing a moment arrive exactly when he knew it would. He took Nathan's hand, thanked the nearest teacher for her efforts, and walked out of the auditorium, under the gaze of 200 people trying to decide whether silence made them innocent. In the parking lot, Nathan asked whether Grandpa was angry because the project had used recycled parts. Julian buckled him into the back seat and said, "No. Sometimes people speak from the part of themselves that's afraid of being wrong." Nathan considered that. Children will accept large truths if you do not insult them with simplification. That night, after Nathan slept, Eleanor came into the kitchen where Julian sat with untouched tea and said Victor had gone too far, but also that he had only said aloud what many people had quietly thought for years. Julian looked at her for a long moment and saw, with a clarity that felt almost gentle now, that she was not defending her father because she fully agreed. She was defending the life built around never disagreeing with him at the point of consequence. He asked her whether she believed Nathan had seen a father ashamed or a father calm. She said that was not the point. He said it was the only point that mattered tonight. Then he stood, rinsed the cup he had not used, and went upstairs. Monday morning, he called Stephen Whitmore and said 4 words. "I am ready. Now." The formal assumption meeting was scheduled for Wednesday in Philadelphia. Julian told Eleanor he had an executive review with a distribution partner and would be back late. She asked if it was serious. He said yes. She said she hoped it led somewhere better. The sentence sat between them with more meaning than she intended, and less than she feared. The original Halcyon building stood in the oldest medical district of Philadelphia, stone-fronted, restrained, and impossible to read quickly. There are buildings that announce wealth, and buildings that embody it so thoroughly they no longer bother. Halcyon belonged to the second category. Inside, the lobby was hushed in the precise way expensive institutions are hushed, not quiet from lack of activity, but quiet from controlled design. Whitmore met him there. So did 4 members of the executive board, none theatrical, all composed. They shook his hand as if they had been expecting not a savior, not a celebrity, but a continuation. Julian appreciated that more than he would have appreciated enthusiasm. They brought him first, not to the boardroom, but to the archive vault beneath the original East Wing. The brass key fit an old iron lock set into a door far too solid for decoration. Inside were sealed charters, transfer ledgers, trust codicils, contingency instruments, handwritten correspondence from founding acquisitions, and the black lacquer box containing active control authorizations requiring his physical signature. Whitmore explained the significance of each document. Julian listened. He asked only exact questions: operational debt exposure, government partnership risk, private liability insulation, end-of-life care division margins, pediatric charity conversion obligations. Not once did he ask how soon the press could be informed. That, more than any credential, told the board what kind of man had arrived. The formal meeting took place in a long room with tall windows and a table polished enough to reflect the underside of power. Julian signed 8 documents. He accepted controlling authority over Halcyon Medical Holdings and its associated structures. He reviewed pending strategic actions. He froze 2 acquisition proposals. He authorized a board ethics review in 2 regional entities. He requested a private audit of all philanthropic partnership exposures involving Victor Hale's foundation-linked investment channels. The narrator notes this carefully. Julian did not ask for revenge. He asked for clarity. Systems, when honestly examined, often create consequences dramatic enough on their own. By Friday, those consequences had begun. Victor received notice that 3 private hospital redevelopment deals he had been positioning himself to influence were entering governance review under Halcyon's new ownership directives. 2 grant-backed projects his office expected to leverage for prestige were paused pending compliance reassessment. A fundraising gala tied to Eleanor's event calendar lost its lead institutional partner until further examination of transparency structures could be completed. Victor made calls. The calls led to other calls. The other calls led, eventually and unwillingly, to Julian's name. He sat with that information alone in his office for 12 minutes before calling Eleanor. She did not answer. He called again. She answered on the 4th ring from her car, and he asked in a voice stripped of its usual certainty whether she knew anything about Julian's connection to Halcyon. Eleanor said she did not understand the question. Victor said, with great effort, that her husband was not what he appeared to be. The line remained silent for a moment. Then Eleanor, who had spent years measuring Julian against visible men, asked the first honest question she had asked about him in a long time. "What is he?" Victor answered, "He is the owner." On Saturday, Grant Mercer visited under the pretense of checking on Nathan after the ceremony incident. Julian opened the door and invited him in. Grant sat in the living room with the careful unease of a man unsure how much the room knows. He said Victor had overreacted. He said Eleanor was fragile. He said public incidents create distortions, and everyone says things they do not mean under pressure. Julian listened. Then he asked Grant how long he had known about Eleanor's intention to separate. Grant's face changed in the small, irreversible way truth changes a face before language can rescue it. He recovered quickly and said he did not know what Julian meant. Julian told him Eleanor had consulted counsel 9 months earlier regarding separation contingencies and asset expectations. He said nothing else for a moment. Then he added that it was interesting how often men become experts in calming a husband when they already know the marriage is being planned around his absence. Grant stood to leave. Julian did not stop him. Some friendships do not end with confrontation. They end when one man understands he no longer owes the other the dignity of uncertainty. Victor came to see Julian the following Tuesday at Halcyon's Philadelphia office. He had not called ahead. Men like Victor are slow to learn the etiquette of diminished certainty. The receptionist informed Whitmore, who informed Julian, who after a pause said Victor could come up for 10 minutes. Victor entered the office with his posture still trying to maintain an authority the room no longer recognized as primary. It was a large office, but not ostentatious. Original wood shelving, medical architecture sketches framed on the walls, historical photographs of the first clinic, the first hospital, the early expansion teams. On the credenza behind Julian's desk sat Margaret's letter in a leather case and the brass key laid beside it. Victor's eyes found the key without understanding why it mattered. Julian remained standing behind the desk. They looked at each other across the office, and for the first time since he had known him, Victor seemed to be studying Julian rather than assessing him. There is a difference. Assessment assumes rank. Study admits uncertainty. Victor said he had been misinformed about several things. Julian said he imagined he had. Victor said the ceremony had become emotional and that public events carry pressures outsiders do not fully grasp. Julian let that sentence die on its own. Victor then said he was prepared to discuss a path forward that would be beneficial to everyone, including Eleanor and Nathan. Julian asked whether Victor had come to apologize or negotiate. Victor did not answer immediately, which was answer enough. The narrator is careful here as well. Power rarely looks more naked than when it first realizes apology and leverage are no longer interchangeable. Julian told him that what happened in the auditorium had not merely insulted him. It had placed Nathan inside a moment a child should never have to interpret later. He said any future access Victor had to Nathan would be shaped not by family habit, not by donor standing, not by social expectation, but by whether Nathan felt safe in his presence. He said this without raising his voice, because truth does not improve when performed. Victor attempted once to invoke Eleanor's suffering. Julian stopped him with a look so quiet it did not register as interruption until after it had already done its work. He said Eleanor was his responsibility to address, not Victor's tool to deploy. He then added, not harshly, that every opinion Victor had formed about him had been built on a version of manhood too shallow to detect substance unless it arrived in polished packaging. He said he did not blame Victor for being wrong. He blamed him for building a moral structure out of wrongness and then inviting other people to live inside it. Victor stood very still. He looked at the historical photographs on the wall, at the name engraved on a foundation plaque, at Julian's desk, at the brass key, and finally back at Julian. Something in his face loosened, not into softness, but into the first rough shape of understanding. He said, lower now, that he had underestimated him. Julian answered, "No, you underestimated what quiet looks like when it's attached to real substance." Victor left without another attempt to control the conversation. That evening, Eleanor came home early. She did not enter with prepared tears or strategic vulnerability. She came into the kitchen, saw Julian at the table, and sat across from him with the exhausted honesty of a woman who has run out of ways to narrate herself favorably. She asked how long he had known. He told her everything. Margaret's letter, the trusts, the hospitals, the board. The ceremony being the final moment, not the first. The 60 days of silence, the observation, the decision not to speak until he no longer needed anyone's recognition in order to act. Eleanor listened without interruption. When he finished, she asked why he had not told her the moment he found out. Julian said he needed to see who she was when she still believed he had nothing that could elevate her in the eyes of the people she feared disappointing. She lowered her eyes at that, because there are some truths argument would only deepen. Then she did something more difficult than crying. She told the truth in plain language. She said she had been unhappy for years. Not because Julian was bad, because she had allowed her father's definition of worth to colonize her judgment until she no longer knew how to see a good man if he arrived without spectacle. She said she had begun imagining a future without him long before she admitted that imagination had become intention. She said the ceremony had shamed her, but not because Victor had been wrong about Julian, because for one terrible moment she had recognized how much of Victor lived in her. Julian looked at her for a long time. Then he said he had loved her sincerely. He said that mattered and would continue to matter even if the marriage did not survive. He said Nathan deserved a home governed by honesty, not endurance masquerading as loyalty. He said he was prepared to separate carefully, cleanly, and without war. Eleanor cried then, but quietly, not to persuade, not to be rescued, simply because some endings only become real once spoken aloud by both people. They spent 2 hours discussing Nathan's schedule, the house, schooling, privacy, and what version of the truth could be given to a child without handing him adult damage he did not need to carry. By the end of that conversation, they were no longer husband and wife in the old sense. They were two parents standing among the remains of something that had once asked better of both of them. Weeks passed. Halcyon stabilized under Julian's leadership faster than the board expected. Not because he moved aggressively, because he moved exactly where pressure required it, and nowhere else. He expanded pediatric emergency funding in 3 under-resourced areas. He restructured an exploitative supplier arrangement Victor had once tried to enter indirectly. He created a scholarship wing in Margaret's name for nursing students from working-class families. He reduced no one to prove a point. That mattered to people who had known power only as appetite. Nathan adjusted better than either parent feared. Children often do when adults stop lying around them. He split his time between homes, carried a backpack too heavy with books and inventions and half-finished questions, and spoke of his parents' separation with the grave practicality children borrow when they realize adults are struggling to remain useful. One Sunday morning in early winter, Julian took Nathan to the original Halcyon building. Not the executive office, not the boardroom. The old East Wing courtyard where the first clinic brick had been preserved under glass and the founders' names were carved into stone. Nathan walked slowly, looking up at the architecture with the solemn curiosity children reserve for places adults do not joke in. He asked if all of this belonged to Julian. Julian answered that ownership is not the same as possession, and one of the hardest things a man can learn is the difference. Nathan thought about that. Then he asked if Grandpa Victor knew. Julian said yes. Nathan asked if that made Grandpa sorry. Julian looked out across the courtyard, where winter light sat on the stone like memory, and said that sometimes being sorry begins long after being wrong. Sometimes it never begins at all. What matters is learning how not to become the injury that shaped you. Nathan nodded as if he would keep that for later. A month after the separation papers were filed, Victor requested to see Nathan in Julian's presence. Julian agreed to a meeting in the garden of Eleanor's new townhouse. Victor arrived without his usual certainty. Age had not suddenly found him. Humility had. It alters a man's posture more effectively. He crouched in front of Nathan and apologized for speaking harshly at the school ceremony. Nathan listened with the formal seriousness of a child, evaluating whether adult language deserves trust. Then he said, "Grandpa should not use big voices for small hearts." Victor closed his eyes for 1 second after hearing that. The narrator does not add to the moment. Some sentences require no decoration. Later, as Victor prepared to leave, he paused beside Julian at the gate and said there had been a time when he believed control was proof of worth. He said he was beginning to understand that control often becomes most aggressive when worth is internally uncertain. Julian did not absolve him. Not every realization earns immediate peace. But he inclined his head once, which in that moment was enough acknowledgement to let the older man leave with some portion of his dignity intact. In December, Julian returned alone to Margaret's grave. He brought no flowers because she had always preferred usefulness to gesture. He brought a folded copy of the scholarship charter bearing her name, a photograph of Nathan holding his latest science prize, and the brass key. The cemetery was nearly empty. The wind moved through the bare trees with the sound of pages turning somewhere just out of sight. Julian stood there for a while before speaking. He told her he had signed. He told her about the board, the hospitals, the audits, the separations, the conversations that mattered, the ones that failed, and the one child still carrying wonder through all of it, with an honesty adults spend years trying to recover. He told her Victor had finally seen him, though perhaps too late to undo everything that seeing him late had cost. He told her Eleanor was trying, in her own painful way, to become someone less borrowed from her father. He told her Halcyon was stable. He told her he had not used power to humiliate the people who had once humiliated him, because she had not raised him to confuse correction with revenge. Then he looked at the brass key in his hand. So much of human life, he thought, is spent mistaking doors for destinations. The key had never been the point. The hospitals were not the point. Even the money, in the cleanest moral accounting, was not the point. The point was that his grandfather had built something vast, and his mother had protected it long enough for it to land in hands that would not use it to announce old injuries as victory. He placed the scholarship charter against the headstone and smiled. Not broadly, not with the relief of a man who had won, but with the quieter peace of a man who had finally ceased trying to explain himself to rooms that were never built to hear him. When he picked Nathan up later that afternoon, the boy came running out of the house carrying a small first aid kit he had turned into an inventor's emergency pack with string, batteries, a magnifying lens, and 3 cookies wrapped in foil. He said if they were going to visit hospitals more often as a family thing now, he should probably be prepared for both injuries and hunger. Julian laughed, fully this time. They drove to a children's care center, recently added under the Halcyon network, one Julian planned to expand. Nathan asked from the back seat whether hospitals ever get scared because people bring them too much sadness. Julian said, "Buildings do not get scared, but people inside them do. And the best institutions are the ones that remember fear deserves kindness, not impatience." Nathan looked out the window and said, "Maybe that is true for families, too." Julian glanced at him in the rear-view mirror, then back at the road. "Yes," he said, "especially families." At the care center, Nathan handed one of the foil-wrapped cookies to a boy in the waiting room whose arm was in a cast and said it was medicine for boredom. The boy accepted it. The mother smiled. Julian watched his son standing there, small and direct, and entirely untrained in the complicated selfishness adults often call wisdom, and felt something in himself settle into proper place. The narrator grows quiet near the end of stories like this, not because there is nothing left to say, but because noise would only weaken what has already arrived. There are men who fill rooms with force because they fear what silence would reveal about them if allowed to remain. There are also men who learn to stand very still because stillness lets truth finish speaking. The world is often slow to tell the difference. Families are slower. Proud men slower still. Julian had been mistaken for less because he never marketed himself as more. That cost him comfort. It cost him years. It cost him a marriage that might, under different ideas of worth, have become something gentler and stronger. But it did not cost him his center. And in the end, that was the only inheritance capable of carrying the rest safely. Real power rarely arrives like applause. It arrives like structure, like signatures, like quiet authority moving through systems built long before the insult and remaining long after it. It does not beg to be recognized. It simply takes its place and lets those who misjudged it discover the size of their error at the speed reality allows. If something in this story stayed with you after the last line, sit with it for a moment. And if you know what it means to be underestimated, until truth finally found its hour, you are not alone.